My hands trembled as the china plate clattered onto the Thanksgiving table. My daughter Melanie's face contorted with rage I had never seen before. "Enough! Mom! Get out of here! No one wants you at this table!" she screamed, slamming her fist down so hard the gravy boat overturned. Stunned silence fell across our family gathering as tears welled in my eyes. Then my husband Jack stood up slowly, his weathered face etched with pain. After 47 years together, I thought I could predict his every move. I was wrong. The morning had started with such promise. The November air was crisp. As Jack and I drove the 20 miles to Melanie's suburban home, our car filled with the scent of my freshly baked pumpkin pies. "Annika," Jack said, reaching for my hand on the console, "today will be good. Try not to worry." But worry had become my constant companion these past 6 months. Something had changed between Melanie and me, a growing distance I couldn't explain. Phone calls that once stretched for hours now ended abruptly after 5 minutes. Invitations to lunch were declined with vague excuses. Even our traditional Sunday afternoon walks had stopped entirely. "I just miss her," I said, watching familiar neighborhoods pass by my window. "Remember how close we were when she was growing up?" Jack nodded, his eyes fixed on the road. "She's busy, Annie. New promotion, teenagers in the house. Give her space." But space felt like abandonment to me. After 43 years as an elementary school principal, retirement last June had left me adrift. The daily rhythm of bells and children's voices had defined me. Without it, who was I? Melanie's mother, Jack's wife, Emma and Tyler's grandmother. But those roles felt increasingly peripheral, especially as Melanie pulled away. We arrived an hour early, as I'd insisted. "I want to help her cook," I'd told Jack. "It's tradition." Melanie answered the door in an apron dusted with flour, her brown hair pulled back in a messy bun. For a fleeting moment, she looked like the little girl who used to stand on a stool beside me, eagerly stirring cookie batter. Then her expression shifted to something cooler. "Mom, Dad, you're early." She hugged Jack warmly but only briefly squeezed my shoulder. The difference stung. "I came to help, sweetie," I said, already untying my coat. "I brought Grandma Louise's cranberry relish recipe and those crystal serving dishes from our wedding." Melanie's kitchen was a flurry of activity. New stainless steel appliances gleamed under recessed lighting, nothing like the cozy, cluttered kitchen where I'd taught her to cook. The counters displayed ingredients arranged in perfect mise en place. "Actually, Mom, I have everything under control," she said, taking the container of cranberry relish. "We're trying some new recipes this year. Paul found them in Bon Appetit." "But we always make Louise's relish," I said, trying to keep disappointment from my voice. "It's been our tradition since before you were born." "Well, traditions change," she said, sliding the container into the refrigerator without opening it. "The kids prefer cranberry sauce with orange zest anyway." For the next hour, I tried to find my place in her kitchen. Each suggestion was politely but firmly deflected. When I reached to adjust the heat under the simmering potatoes, Melanie intercepted my hand. "Mom, please. I know what I'm doing." "I just thought they looked a little hot," I said. "They're supposed to be." "It's a different technique." Her voice had an edge that made me step back. By the time Paul and the kids returned from picking up his mother at the airport, tension hung in the kitchen like steam. Emma, 15 and newly serious with her glasses and straightened hair, gave me a quick hug before disappearing into her phone. Tyler, 12 and still caught between childhood and adolescence, showed me his latest video game score before Melanie called him to set the table. "Mom, why don't you relax in the living room? Everything's almost ready," Melanie said, more command than suggestion. As family gathered and appetizers circulated, I noticed strange glances between Melanie and Jack, whispered conversations that stopped when I approached. Something was wrong, but nobody was telling me what. During a lull in conversation, I tried to lighten the mood. "So, Melanie, tell everyone about your promotion, marketing director for the whole Northwest region. We're so proud of you." The room grew uncomfortably quiet. Melanie set down her wine glass with deliberate care. "That's just like you, Mom," she said, her voice low and controlled. "Always bringing up my career like you actually supported it." "What?" "Of course I support your career," I said, genuinely confused. Melanie laughed, a harsh sound nothing like her usual warm chuckle. "Really? After you spent my entire childhood pushing me toward education? After you told me marketing was selling out?" I never said that, I protested, though a vague memory surfaced of questioning whether the corporate world would fulfill her creative spirit. You never had to say it directly. Your disappointment was clear enough. Melanie's eyes flashed. But you know what? I've been talking about this in therapy for months now. Therapy? I looked around the table, searching for someone else who seemed surprised by this revelation. No one would meet my eyes. Yes, therapy. To deal with having a controlling mother who never let me be myself. Her voice rose with each word. Who had to micromanage every decision, every hobby, every friendship. Who's still trying to control how I cook in my own kitchen? Her accusation hit like a physical blow. The table fell silent as the first devastating twist in our Thanksgiving story began to unfold. Dinner began in uncomfortable silence. The only sounds were the clink of silverware and the occasional request to pass a dish. Emma and Tyler exchanged worried glances, while Paul concentrated on cutting his turkey into perfectly even pieces. Jack tried to catch my eye, but I couldn't look at him. My hands trembled slightly as I served myself a spoonful of mashed potatoes I no longer wanted. My mind raced back to my own childhood, to holidays spent tiptoeing around my mother's alcohol-induced mood swings. How many times had I promised myself I would be different? That my children would feel supported, not suffocated? That they would never fear expressing themselves around me? "Melanie," I finally said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I had no idea you felt this way. Everything I did, I was trying to give you the support I never had." Melanie pushed food around her plate. "That's the problem, Mom. You think support means control. You couldn't separate your dreams from mine." "That's not fair," I said, feeling defensive despite myself. "I encouraged your interests, all those art classes, the creative writing camps. The ones you chose for me," she countered. "The ones that fit your vision of who I should be." Jack cleared his throat. "Let's try to keep this civil. It's Thanksgiving, after all." "Civil?" Melanie's laugh was bitter. "We've been civil for 38 years. That's the problem." Paul reached for her hand. "Mel, maybe today isn't the best time for all this." She pulled away from him. "When is the right time, Paul? When Mom and Dad are visiting next month? At Christmas? There's never a good time to confront painful truths." Tyler, looking miserable, asked to be excused. Emma stayed, watching the adult drama unfold with fascinated apprehension. "Tyler, stay at the table," Melanie said sharply. "Family matters involve everyone." I recognized my own words from decades ago, echoing in her command, and it made me wince. Had I forced her to sit through uncomfortable family discussions? Had I mistaken exposure for inclusion? Trying to ease the tension, I turned to Emma. "How are your advanced classes going, sweetie? Your mom mentioned you're doing exceptionally well in English." For a moment, normalcy seemed possible as Emma described her literature analysis project. I noticed how thoughtfully she spoke, how her eyes lit up discussing the themes she'd discovered. So much like Melanie at that age, with her journal always in hand, scribbling stories and observations. "That reminds me of your writing, Melanie," I said, smiling at the memory. "Remember those beautiful short stories you wrote in high school? I always thought you had such talent." The shift in Melanie's expression was immediate and alarming. Something calculating replaced her anger, and she exchanged a look with Paul that I couldn't interpret. "Funny you should mention my writing, Mom," she said, setting down her fork. "I've actually been working on something for the past year." "Really? That's wonderful," I said, genuinely pleased. Creative expression had always been Melanie's refuge. She took a long sip of wine before continuing. "It's a memoir, actually. It's called Controlled: Growing Up with a Mother Who Couldn't Let Go. My publisher thinks it could really resonate with people who've experienced similar relationships." The table went silent again. I felt the blood drain from my face. "A memoir? About me?" "About us," she corrected. "About our relationship and its impact on my development." I looked at Jack, expecting to see shock matching my own. Instead, he studied his plate, his expression troubled but not surprised. "You knew about this?" I asked him. Before he could answer, Melanie continued. "That's not all. I also host a podcast called Motherbound. It examines toxic maternal relationships and their lasting effects. It's actually quite popular." "How popular?" Paul asked, looking uncomfortable. 80,000 subscribers now," she said with unmistakable pride. "We're getting sponsorship offers weekly." The betrayal cut deep. My daughter had been publicly dissecting our relationship, portraying me as some kind of monster to strangers, and I'd known nothing about it. 80,000 people listening to stories about what a terrible mother I was? My voice cracked. How could you, Melanie? I use a pseudonym, she said, as if that made it better. No one knows it's specifically about you. But you know, I said. Jack knows. Paul knows. I looked around the table, feeling suddenly exposed. Who else knows? I do, said a voice from the doorway. A tall woman with styled auburn hair stood there, holding a glass of wine. I'd been introduced to her earlier as Diane, a friend of Melanie's joining us for dinner. Now her presence took on new significance. Diane is my publisher, Melanie explained. She came today to discuss next steps for the book launch. My family Thanksgiving had been turned into a business meeting about marketing my alleged parental failures. The pain of this revelation left me speechless. Diane moved to take the empty seat beside Melanie. Your daughter's story is powerful, Mrs. Lambert. It's going to help a lot of people recognize unhealthy patterns in their own families. I found my voice again. And what qualifies you to determine our relationship was unhealthy? A few hours of conversation with my daughter? Mom, Melanie warned. Diane is doing her job. Her job is exploiting family pain for profit. I shot back, then immediately regretted my harshness. This wasn't who I wanted to be. I think everyone needs to calm down, Jack said, ever the peacemaker. I agree, said Diane smoothly, which is why I thought it might help to actually hear a clip from Melanie's podcast, to understand the kind of authentic sharing that's resonating with listeners. Before I could object, she pulled out her phone and tapped the screen. Melanie's voice, slightly altered but unmistakable, filled the dining room. One of the most devastating moments came during my senior year of high school. The recording began. I'd applied for a prestigious writing scholarship at Northwestern. My teacher, Mrs. Halloway, had personally recommended me and told me I was a frontrunner. Then, 2 weeks before the announcement, my application was mysteriously withdrawn. I was devastated. I listened in growing horror as the story continued. Years later, Mrs. Halloway confided in me that my mother had called the scholarship committee. She told them I wasn't emotionally ready for such pressure and asked them to remove me from consideration. My mother was an influential educator in our district, so they complied. She never told me what she'd done. She just held me while I cried over losing my dream opportunity, knowing she was the one who had destroyed it. Diane stopped the recording, looking satisfied. That episode has over 100,000 downloads. I stared at Melanie, completely stunned. That never happened. I would never have done such a thing. Mrs. Halloway told me everything, Melanie insisted, her eyes challenging. Then she lied, I said firmly. Or you misunderstood, because I never contacted any scholarship committee. Ever. The room grew tense with doubt and suspicion. I looked at the faces around me, wondering who believed this horrible fabrication. As Diane smiled with professional detachment, I realized we had crossed into far more painful territory than I could have imagined. I don't understand, I said, my voice barely audible. How could you believe I would sabotage your future? The turkey and fixings grew cold as the atmosphere chilled further. Because it fits the pattern, Mom, Melanie replied. You supported my dreams only when they aligned with yours. The scholarship would have taken me to Chicago, away from your influence. That's not true, I insisted, feeling the familiar frustration of being misunderstood by my daughter. I was thrilled about that scholarship opportunity. I helped you edit your application essay, remember? I stayed up all night going through it line by line. Only to make sure it reflected well on you, she countered. Jack shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Melanie, is it possible you misremembered some details about this scholarship situation? No, Dad. Mrs. Halloway was very clear. I turned to Paul, who had known Melanie since college. Paul, have you heard this story before? Do you believe I would do such a thing? Paul looked trapped between loyalty to his wife and his own judgment. I know you've always been supportive of our family, Annika. You helped us with the down payment on this house. You watch the kids whenever we need you. Don't make her sound like a saint, Melanie snapped. Financial help comes with strings attached. It always has. What strings? I asked, genuinely perplexed. When have I ever asked for anything in return? You don't have to ask explicitly. Your expectations are clear in every disappointed look, every subtle comment about our choices. Emma, who had been silent, suddenly spoke up. I think Grandma's always been nice to us. She comes to all my violin concerts, even the really bad ones. Emma, you don't understand adult relationships, Melanie said dismissively. Don't talk to her that way, I said, surprised by the sharpness in my voice. She's expressing her opinion, which she has every right to do. Melania flushed. Now you're parenting my child? No. I'm defending her right to speak, just as I always defended yours. Paul attempted intervention again. Maybe we should take a break from this conversation. No, said Diane, leaning forward with professional interest. This is exactly the kind of authentic family dynamic that readers connect with. The intergenerational patterns are fascinating. This isn't a focus group for your marketing strategy, I said coldly. This is my family. Diane smiled with practiced sympathy. Mrs. Lambert, I understand this is difficult. But your daughter's story has already helped thousands of women recognize controlling patterns in their own mother-daughter relationships. Based on fabrications like the scholarship story? I challenged. We present Melanie's lived experience, Diane replied smoothly. Perception is reality in memoir. No, I said firmly. Reality is reality, and the reality is I never contacted that scholarship committee. Melanie's voice rose. Are you calling me a liar? I'm saying that story isn't true. Whether you believe it happened is something else entirely. There are other incidents, Melanie said, like when you convinced Dad we couldn't afford for me to attend art school in New York. I looked at Jack incredulously. That's not what happened. We couldn't afford the $60,000 per year without massive loans. We discussed it as a family. You manipulated the conversation, Melanie insisted. You always do. My patience began to fray. Have you considered that your lived experience might be colored by something other than what actually occurred? That maybe your publisher's encouragement to find dramatic stories might be affecting your memory? Diane interjected. That's an unfair characterization of our editorial relationship. Is it? I asked. How many dramatic confrontations appear in this memoir? How many moments of maternal sabotage that no one else witnessed? How many conversations that conveniently have no other participants who could verify what was said? Paul cleared his throat. Actually, I've wondered the same thing. Some of the stories Melanie's included in the book draft, they don't match what I've observed over the years. Melanie turned to him, betrayal flashing in her eyes. You're taking her side? I'm not taking sides, he said carefully. But the scholarship story never made sense to me. You told me your mother was devastated when you didn't get it. She called the committee herself to find out why. People can act, Paul, she said dismissively. For what purpose? I asked. What would I possibly gain by sabotaging your education? Control, Melanie said simply. You couldn't stand the thought of me developing independently, away from your influence. I felt a profound sadness settle over me. Is that really how you see me? As someone so insecure and manipulative that I'd sacrifice your happiness for my own need for control? The evidence speaks for itself, she said. What evidence? Memories that no one can verify? Interpretations of motives you've assigned to me? I was trying to remain calm, but hurt made my voice shake. Have you ever once considered asking me directly about these incidents before publishing them for the world to hear? Tyler, who had been watching this exchange with growing distress, suddenly spoke up. Mom, Grandma doesn't seem like the person you talk about in your podcast. She lets me make mistakes with my science projects. She says it's how we learn. Melanie shot him a warning look. Tyler, this is complicated adult business. But you said I should stay and listen, because family matters involve everyone, he countered, using her words against her. A flash of something like shame crossed Melanie's face before hardening again. Some things you're too young to understand. Like the truth? The words escaped me before I could stop them. Melanie stood abruptly. That's it. I've had enough of your passive-aggressive comments and your attempts to turn my own children against me. Melanie, please, Jack started, but she cut him off. No, Dad. I invited Mom here today hoping we could have an honest conversation, but she's just doing what she always does. Denying, deflecting, making herself the victim. I invited her to what? I asked, looking around the table. You planned this confrontation for Thanksgiving dinner? With your children present? With a publisher as an audience? Diane at least had the grace to look uncomfortable. The holiday timing was Melanie's idea. A sudden clarity washed over me. This isn't about healing our relationship. This is a publicity stunt for your book. That's not true, Melanie protested, but her eyes slid toward Diane. Isn't it? What better way to create buzz than a dramatic holiday confrontation? I'm sure it will make a compelling chapter. The hurt in my voice was unmistakable. Melanie's face flushed with anger. Enough! Mom! Get out of here! No one wants you at this table. Her scream was followed by her fist slamming down so hard that the gravy boat overturned, sending dark liquid spreading across the white tablecloth. Emma gasped. Tyler looked close to tears. Paul stared at his wife, as if seeing a stranger. I sat frozen, unable to process the raw hatred in my daughter's voice. Slowly, I gathered my napkin and purse, dignity my only remaining shield. "I'll wait in the car, Jack," I said quietly, standing on shaky legs. That's when Jack stood up too, his weathered face etched with pain. The lines around his mouth deepened as he looked at our daughter with an expression I'd rarely seen in our 47 years together. Not anger exactly, but a profound disappointment mixed with resolve. "No, Annie," he said, "you're not going anywhere alone." Then he did something that shocked everyone at the table. He walked to a small briefcase he'd brought in earlier and set it on the sideboard. From it, he withdrew a thick manila folder. "Melanie," he said, his voice steady, "there's something you should know. I've been aware of your podcast and book project for the past 2 months." The revelation hit me like another slap. My husband had known about our daughter's public dissection of our family and said nothing. "You knew?" I whispered. Jack nodded, regret evident in his eyes. "I've been meeting with Melanie and a family therapist to try to understand what's happening here." This second betrayal left me speechless. I sank back into my chair, trying to process the fact that the 2 people I trusted most had been discussing me behind my back for months. "Why didn't you tell me?" I finally managed. "I wanted to understand both sides before our family completely fell apart," Jack said. "And I'm glad I did, because what I discovered was troubling." He opened the folder and spread several documents on the cleared part of the table. "Melanie, I think it's time we talk about what's actually true and what isn't." "Dad, what are you doing?" Melanie asked, eyeing the folder with sudden wariness. Jack adjusted his reading glasses, his movements deliberate. "Getting to the truth, which is something we should have done months ago." The room fell silent as he sorted through the papers with methodical precision. I noticed his hands, once so steady with architectural drafting tools, now showed slight tremors of age. Or perhaps it was emotion. "When you first told me about your podcast and book," Jack continued, "I was shocked. The mother you described wasn't the woman I've been married to for nearly 5 decades. But I also know that parents and children can experience the same events very differently." Melanie crossed her arms defensively. "So you investigated me? Your own daughter?" "No," Jack replied evenly. "I investigated the truth. There's a difference." He pulled out the first document. "Let's start with the Northwestern scholarship story. I contacted Margaret Halloway last month." "You spoke to Mrs. Halloway?" Melanie's voice had lost some of its certainty. Jack nodded. "She was quite surprised to hear she'd allegedly told you that your mother interfered with the scholarship. In fact, she wrote this letter to clarify what actually happened." He handed a printed email to Melanie, who took it reluctantly. Paul leaned in to read over her shoulder. "She says she never told you any such thing," Jack continued. "In fact, she says your mother called the committee repeatedly when you didn't get the scholarship, trying to understand why such a promising student had been overlooked." "That's not what happened," Melanie insisted, but her voice wavered. "Mrs. Halloway has no reason to lie," Jack said. "Unlike your publisher, who seems to have a financial interest in dramatic family conflict." Diane shifted uncomfortably in her seat. "My role is simply to help Melanie tell her story." "Her story or your story?" I asked, finding my voice. "Because those seem to be 2 very different things at this point." Jack continued, pulling out more documents. "I also found the financial records from when Melanie was in college. You claimed we refused to support your education in New York because your mother wanted to keep you close to home." He spread bank statements across the table. "The truth is, we took out a second mortgage on our house to help fund your education at State University. We couldn't afford art school in New York, but we stretched ourselves to the breaking point to give you the best education we could manage." I remembered those lean years, the careful budgeting, the vacations we didn't take, the home repairs we postponed. all to ensure our daughter had opportunities we hadn't. You could have found a way if you really wanted me to go to New York, Melanie argued, but with less conviction. $60,000 per year wasn't possible on a principal's salary and an architect's income, Jack said firmly. We were already putting $30,000 a year toward your education. These bank statements prove it. He turned to me, regret in his eyes. Annie, I'm sorry I didn't tell you about the podcast and book sooner. I was trying to understand what was happening, to see if Melanie's perspective had any basis in reality before our whole family imploded. While you were investigating, I was being portrayed as a monster to thousands of strangers, I said, hurt evident in my voice. I know, he acknowledged. That was my mistake. I thought I could resolve this privately. Paul had been reading through the documents, his expression growing increasingly troubled. Mel, these records contradict several key stories in your draft. The scholarship, the college funding, even that incident you described about your mom deliberately humiliating you at your high school graduation. What about my graduation? I asked, confused. I was so proud of you that day, Melanie. You were valedictorian. You made it about yourself, Melanie said, but her accusation lacked its earlier fire. You told everyone it was because of your guidance and support. Jack shook his head and produced another document. I found the video recording of that day. Your mother never made such comments. In fact, she specifically told the principal that all credit belonged to you when he congratulated her. Doubt flickered across Melanie's face. She said those things later, at the party. We have videos of the party too, Jack said gently. Your Aunt Susan recorded everything. Your mother spent the entire time telling everyone how independent and self-motivated you were, how you had surpassed anything she had achieved. Tears welled in my eyes at the memory. I had been so bursting with pride that day, watching my brilliant daughter stand at the podium, knowing the remarkable woman she was becoming. Emma, who had been listening intently, turned to her mother. Mom, why would you make up stories about Grandma? Melanie flinched at the direct question. I didn't make up anything. I wrote about my experiences as I remembered them. Memory isn't always reliable, Paul said carefully, especially when there's a narrative you're invested in. What's that supposed to mean? Melanie demanded. Paul hesitated, then spoke with gentle firmness. You've become increasingly focused on painting yourself as a victim, Mel. At first, I supported your journey to understand your relationship with your mother, but over time I've watched you reshape memories to fit a narrative that sells better. That's not fair, Melanie protested. Isn't it? Paul continued. 2 years ago, you told me your mother was overprotective but well-meaning. Now suddenly she's a manipulative monster who deliberately sabotaged your future? Which version is true? Diane intervened smoothly. Memory is complex. Trauma can affect how we recall events. Or publishers can affect how we shape our stories, Jack countered, especially when there's money and attention involved. Diane bristled. I resent the implication that I would encourage fabrication. Would you call it enhancing instead? Jack asked pointedly. Because I have copies of email exchanges between you and Melanie, where you specifically suggest she enhance certain incidents to make them more marketable. Color drained from Diane's face. Those were private communications, which Melanie forwarded to her family therapist, who shared them with me out of concern for the therapeutic process, Jack explained. You told my daughter that good memoir sometimes requires emotional truth over literal truth. You suggested she dramatize the controlling aspects of her mother's behavior to create a more compelling narrative arc. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Diane began gathering her things. I think perhaps I should go. Perhaps you should, Jack agreed coldly. As Diane made her exit, Melanie looked stunned, her carefully constructed narrative crumbling around her. Dad, those emails were taken out of context. Were they? Jack asked. Or were they exactly what they appeared to be? Encouragement to distort the truth for profit? The accusation hung in the air. Tyler, who had been watching this unfold with wide eyes, suddenly asked, Mom, does that mean your podcast isn't real? Melanie looked at her son, then at her daughter, both watching her with new uncertainty. It's complicated, Tyler. It seems pretty simple to me, Emma said with teenage directness. Either Grandma did those terrible things, or she didn't. I sat quietly, letting the weight of evidence speak for itself. Part of me wanted to reach out to Melanie, to assure her that despite everything, My love remained unchanged. But another part needed her to recognize the harm her fabrications had caused. "Why, Melanie?" I finally asked. "Why would you do this?" For the first time, genuine emotion broke through her defensive posture. Because it was easier than admitting the truth. "Which is what?" Jack prompted gently. Melanie's carefully constructed facade began to crumble. "That I'm the one who's become controlling, that I've been projecting my own issues onto you, Mom." The admission hung in the air, a first step toward honesty that offered a glimmer of hope amid the devastation. The silence following Melanie's admission felt fragile, as if the slightest wrong word might shatter any chance of healing. Paul reached for her hand, and this time, she didn't pull away. "I don't understand," I said carefully. "What do you mean you've been projecting?" Melanie looked down at the table, her anger replaced by something more vulnerable. "The podcast started as genuine exploration. I felt suffocated growing up, always trying to meet your high standards. I never meant to set standards you couldn't reach," I said softly. "I only wanted you to believe in your potential." "I know that now," she admitted. "But as a child, as a teenager, I interpreted your encouragement as pressure. Your support felt like control." Jack placed a hand on my shoulder. "We both push too hard sometimes, Annie. We have to acknowledge that." I nodded, willing to accept my share of responsibility. "We're not perfect parents, Melanie. We made mistakes. But there's a vast difference between imperfect parenting and the deliberate sabotage you've described in your podcast." Melanie's eyes filled with tears. "The podcast started getting attention when I focused on the most dramatic elements of our relationship. Diane said audiences respond to clear villains and heroes. And she cast me as the villain," I concluded. "She said nuance doesn't sell," Melanie acknowledged. "She pushed for more dramatic stories, more evidence of your controlling nature. When I couldn't find enough real examples, I started elaborating." "Elaborating or fabricating?" Jack asked, his voice gentle but firm. Melanie wiped at her eyes. "Both. The scholarship story. Mrs. Holloway never told me you interfered. I created that because it fit the narrative we were building." The admission stung, even though I'd known the story wasn't true. "Do you have any idea how much that hurt? Hearing you tell thousands of strangers that I deliberately destroyed your opportunities?" "I'm sorry," she whispered. "The podcast took on a life of its own. The more dramatic our mother-daughter conflict, the more subscribers we got. The more sponsors wanted to be associated with us." Paul looked troubled. "You never told me you were fabricating stories, Mel." "I started believing them myself," she admitted. "I convinced myself these things must have happened, that they explained why I felt so." She trailed off. "So what?" I prompted. "So afraid of failure," she finished quietly. "So terrified of not measuring up. It was easier to blame you than to face my own insecurities." A piece of the puzzle clicked into place. "Is that why you've been pulling away these past 6 months? Because of the podcast and book?" Melanie nodded. "I couldn't look you in the eye knowing what I was saying about you. And the few times we were together, I found myself looking for evidence to support my narrative, twisting your words and actions to fit what I needed for the next episode." Paul spoke up. "Melanie has been under enormous pressure at work. The promotion came with expectations she wasn't prepared for. When things got tough, Diane approached her about turning her blog posts on mother-daughter relationships into a podcast series. The timing wasn't coincidental," Melanie acknowledged. "Diane found me when I was vulnerable, questioning myself. She suggested channeling my professional stress into exploring my relationship with my mother, the root of my perfectionism and fear of failure. I thought about the countless therapy sessions I'd attended after my own mother's death, working through the legacy of growing up with alcoholism and emotional neglect. How desperately I'd tried not to pass that pain to Melanie. "I never wanted you to feel the way my mother made me feel," I said quietly. "Invisible, worthless, responsible for her happiness." "You didn't," Melanie admitted. "You were nothing like Grandma Helen. You were present, engaged, sometimes too engaged." "Then why create this false narrative?" Jack asked. Diane had left the folder containing her correspondence with Melanie on the table. Paul picked it up and read from one email. "The mother as antagonist is a powerful archetype in women's memoir. Readers connect with the struggle against maternal control. The more specific and dramatic the examples, the stronger the audience response." "She encouraged you to manufacture conflict," I realized. "And I let her," Melanie said, because the podcast was successful in ways my actual career wasn't. Being a victim gave me a platform, an identity, a community. Emma, who had been listening intently, suddenly spoke. Mom, is that why you got so upset when I wanted to go to Grandma's writing workshop last summer? Because it didn't fit your story about her being controlling? Melanie flinched. Emma, it's complicated. You said Grandma would take over and try to mold me into her vision, Emma persisted. But when I went anyway, she just helped us develop our own ideas. She never told anyone what to write. I remember that workshop, I said. You wrote that beautiful piece about ocean conservation. I was so impressed by your research. Emma nodded enthusiastically. Grandma never tried to change my topic, even though it wasn't her interest area. She just helped me make my own ideas stronger. Melanie looked stricken. I projected my issues onto your relationship with your grandmother. You've been doing it with me too, Tyler added with surprising insight for a 12-year-old. Whenever I want to call Grandma or visit her, you find reasons why I can't. Oh, Mel, Paul said softly. What happened to us? I got lost, she whispered. Between the pressure at work, the attention from the podcast, Diane's constant pushing for more dramatic content, I started believing the narrative we were creating. Jack pulled out another document from his folder. I have one more thing to share. This is the letter your mother wrote to the Northwestern Scholarship Committee when you didn't get selected. He handed it to Melanie. As she read, fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. You appealed their decision, she said, looking up at me. You told them they were making a terrible mistake, that I was the most talented young writer you'd ever encountered. Of course I did, I said. I believed in you completely. They still said no, she remembered. Yes, but not because you weren't good enough, I explained. Their decision had been made, but I couldn't stand by without advocating for you. Melanie set the letter down carefully. All these years, I've carried resentment based on a story I invented. Why didn't you just ask me about the scholarship? I wondered. Because the truth wouldn't have served the narrative, she admitted. And eventually, I couldn't separate fact from fiction anymore. Paul had been examining more of the documents from Jack's investigation. Melanie, these emails between you and Diane, she explicitly suggested you enhance stories for marketing appeal. She coached you on creating more dramatic content. Melanie looked ashamed. She said memoir is about emotional truth, not literal events. That's convenient for selling books, but devastating for families, Jack observed. I'm so sorry, Melanie whispered, looking around the table at the family she had wounded with her fabrications. I wanted to comfort her, to say everything would be okay. But the hurt ran too deep for easy platitudes. Trust had been broken, lies had been told. Our relationship had been commodified for public consumption. Yet somewhere beneath my pain, I felt a glimmer of hope. The truth, however painful, was finally emerging. And truth was the necessary foundation for any healing that might follow. The turkey had grown cold, the stuffing congealed, but no one at the table seemed to notice. The traditional Thanksgiving feast had been replaced by a different kind of nourishment, hard truth. I sat quietly, processing all that had been revealed. My daughter had rewritten our history, casting me as a villain for profit and attention. My husband had investigated behind my back. Our family had fractured along fault lines I hadn't even known existed. Yet beneath my hurt, something unexpected was stirring, a strange sense of calm. After months of confusion about Melanie's distance, at least now I understood its source. Fabricated or not, her grievances were in the open. I took a deep breath and straightened my shoulders, feeling a familiar strength return. For 43 years as an elementary school principal, I had mediated countless conflicts, guided troubled children, and counseled struggling parents. I had faced school board battles and budget crises with steady resolve. Why had I been so easily devastated by my daughter's accusations? Perhaps because they struck at my deepest insecurity, that despite my best efforts, I had somehow failed as a mother. Melanie, I said finally, my voice finding its natural authority. What your publisher encouraged you to do was deeply unethical. She exploited your vulnerability and insecurity for profit. Melanie looked up, surprised by my direct approach. But, I continued, she could only exploit what was already there. Your feelings about our relationship, however distorted they became, started somewhere real. Jack touched my hand. Annie. No, Jack, this needs to be said. I turned back to Melanie. I was not the mother your podcast describes. I never sabotaged your opportunities or tried to control your destiny. But I wasn't perfect either. No parent is. Melanie's defenses seemed to lower slightly. I know you weren't as bad as I portrayed you. What I want to understand is what was real in your experience, I said. Strip away Diane's influence, the podcast's need for drama. What genuinely hurt you about how I mothered you? The directness of the question seemed to catch her off guard. For a moment, I glimpsed the little girl who had always valued honesty above all else. You had such high expectations, she said quietly. Your standards for excellence were so ingrained in our household that I never felt I could just be average at something. Every achievement became baseline, not exceptional. I nodded, recognizing the truth in her words. I pushed for excellence because I believed in your capabilities, but I can see how that constant pressure might have felt overwhelming. And you were so confident, she continued, so sure of your opinions and choices. It was intimidating. Sometimes I made decisions just to please you because arguing seemed impossible. This surprised me. I thought I encouraged your independence. You encouraged independence that looked like yours, Melanie clarified. When my choices mirrored your values, you called it independence. When they didn't, you called it poor judgment. The observation stung, but I forced myself to consider it honestly. Had I confused agreement with independence? Had I subtly punished choices that diverged from my vision? I never intentionally did that, I said carefully. But I need to acknowledge that may have been your experience. Paul spoke up. This feels like the first honest conversation you two have had in years. Maybe ever, Melanie admitted. I thought about my own mother, how her alcoholism had made genuine conversation impossible, how I'd vowed my relationship with my children would be different, open, honest, supportive. I had a mother who couldn't see me, I said, emotion thickening my voice, who was too lost in her own pain to notice mine. Everything I did as your mother was an attempt to be what she couldn't. To see you, to support you, to help you believe in yourself. I know that, Mom, Melanie said softly. That's what makes this situation so complicated. Your intentions were good. But impact matters more than intention, I acknowledged. If my support felt like pressure, if my encouragement felt like control, then I need to hear that. Jack, who had been listening intently, added, We both do. I wasn't just a bystander in your upbringing, Mel. You were always the safe one, Dad, she said. The one who moderated Mom's intensity. The characterization hurt, but contained a grain of truth. Jack had often been the one to suggest I ease up, to remind me that childhood should include freedom to explore and even fail. Emma, watching this exchange with teenage perceptiveness, suddenly asked, Mom, are you doing to me what you claim Grandma did to you? The question landed like a thunderclap. Melanie looked startled. What do you mean? You get upset when I want to spend time with Grandma, Emma explained. You critique my outfits, my friends, my school project choices. Last month, you rewrote my English paper because you said it wasn't good enough. That's different, Melanie protested. I was helping you. Like Grandma helped you? Emma asked innocently. Melanie fell silent, the parallel clearly troubling her. Tyler added, You got really mad when I wanted to quit baseball, even though I told you I hated it. You said Lamberts don't quit. Paul looked uncomfortable. Kids, this isn't the time. Actually, I interrupted gently, I think this is exactly the time. Melanie, are you seeing the pattern? Melanie's face flushed. I'm not like that all the time. Neither was I said simply. But the moments when we exert control over our children's choices are the ones they remember most vividly. This isn't about me, Melanie insisted. We're discussing your controlling behavior. We were, I acknowledged. But perhaps the most valuable insight here is how patterns repeat across generations when we're not conscious of them. Jack nodded. That's what the family therapist kept trying to tell us, Mel. That your frustration with your mother might actually be helping you recognize similar tendencies in yourself. A long silence followed as Melanie seemed to struggle with this perspective. Finally, she looked at her children. Do I really make you feel that way? Like your choices aren't your own? Emma and Tyler exchanged glances. Sometimes, Emma admitted, especially lately, since your podcast started. This seemed to shake Melanie more than anything else had. I've become what I claim to be fighting against. Not entirely, I offered. Awareness is the first step toward change. It took me years of therapy after my mother's death to recognize how her parenting had shaped mine, for better and worse. You went to therapy? Melanie seemed surprised. For 3 years after Grandma Helen died, Jack confirmed. Your mother was determined to break unhealthy patterns. You never told me, Melanie said. Parents of your generation didn't discuss their therapy with their children, I explained. Maybe we should have been more open about our own struggles and healing processes. The conversation had shifted from accusation to reflection, from blame to understanding. Though tension still lingered, a pathway toward reconciliation seemed possible for the first time. I reached into my purse and pulled out a small wrapped package I'd brought for after dinner. I have something for you, Melanie. I was going to give this to you later, but now seems appropriate. What is it? She asked cautiously. Something I've been working on for the past 20 years, I said, pushing it across the table. Melanie unwrapped the package to reveal a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age. She opened it and found my handwriting filling page after page. I've been writing to you since you were 18, I explained. Letters I never sent. About my hopes for you, my fears, my regrets about mistakes I made as your mother. Questions I wanted to ask but didn't know how. Melanie looked up, shocked. You've been journaling about our relationship for 20 years? I nodded. When you left for college, I felt such a complex mix of emotions. Pride in your independence, fear that I hadn't prepared you well enough, guilt over arguments we'd had, hope for your future. Writing helped me process those feelings. But why didn't you share these with me? She asked, carefully turning the fragile pages. Some of it felt too raw. Some I thought you weren't ready to hear, and honestly, some I wasn't brave enough to say directly. I met her eyes, but I think you're ready for all of it now. The real story of us, from my perspective. Not perfect, not villainous, just human. As Melanie read a random entry from 10 years earlier, tears filled her eyes. You wrote that you worried you'd pushed me too hard, that your fear of my experiencing your childhood instability might have made you too rigid. I did worry about that, I acknowledged. Still do. And here, she continued reading, you wrote about how proud you were when I stood up to you about moving to Seattle for my first job, even though you thought it was a mistake. You said it showed I had the courage of my convictions. That took real independence, I said. I respected it, even when I disagreed with the choice. Melanie closed the journal, holding it carefully. This is the real story, isn't it? Not the simplified villain narrative Diane pushed for, but this complex, imperfect relationship between two strong-willed women. 2 generations of strong-willed women, Emma corrected, bringing a small smile to everyone's faces. 3 generations, I amended, including Emma, each trying to do better than the last. The truth of this statement settled over the table, offering a perspective larger than any individual grievance. We were part of a continuum, each generation struggling with the legacy of the one before while trying to improve the inheritance of the one to follow. Melanie looked at the journal, then at me, her expression more open than it had been in months. Mom, would you be willing to attend family therapy with me? Not with Diane's recommended therapist, but someone new, neutral? The invitation felt like the first green shoot after a long winter. Yes, I said simply. I would like that very much. 3 months after that fateful Thanksgiving dinner, I found myself sitting in a comfortable office with warm lighting and tasteful artwork on the walls. Beside me sat Jack, across from us Melanie and Paul. Between us, Dr. Marshall, the family therapist we had all agreed upon after careful consideration. I think we've made remarkable progress, Dr. Marshall observed, looking at her notes from our previous sessions. Would anyone like to share reflections on these past 12 weeks? I glanced at Melanie, who nodded for me to go first. When we started, I said carefully, I didn't think we could rebuild what had been broken. The betrayal felt too deep. I paused, finding the right words. But I've learned that understanding doesn't require perfect agreement. We can acknowledge different experiences of shared events without invalidating each other. That's been key, Dr. Marshall agreed. Melanie, your thoughts? Melanie had changed over these months. The defensive edge that had characterized her at Thanksgiving had softened. She seemed more reflective, less reactive. I've had to confront some difficult truths, she admitted, about how I distorted memories to fit a narrative that wasn't entirely fair or accurate, about how I've been repeating patterns with my own children that I criticized in my mother. She turned toward me. The journal you gave me. Reading your perspective over all those years has been enlightening. Seeing your doubts, your questions, your awareness of your own imperfections. It humanized you in a way my podcast never did. What about the podcast and book? Dr. Marshall asked. You mentioned making decisions about those projects. Melanie nodded. After severing ties with Diane, I took some time to reflect on what I really wanted to accomplish. I decided to transform the memoir into something more balanced and honest. Motherlines, generations of women finding their voice, Jack said, pride evident in his voice. A collaborative project now. Mom agreed to contribute her perspective, Melanie explained, along with Emma, and even some reflections from my grandmother's letters that Dad found in the attic. 4 generations of women in our family, examining how we've communicated, where we've struggled, and how we've grown. And the podcast? Dr. Marshall prompted. Completely reimagined, Melanie said. Instead of Motherbound, which focused on toxic maternal relationships, I've launched The Generational Bridge. It explores how families can heal rifts, break unhealthy patterns, and build stronger connections across generations. Your first episode had impressive numbers, Paul added supportively. Probably because it was so honest, Melanie acknowledged. Admitting my mistakes publicly wasn't easy, but listeners responded to the authenticity. I reached over and squeezed her hand, still amazed at how far we had come. The journey hadn't been easy. Those first few therapy sessions had been filled with tears, defensiveness, and painful excavations of old hurts. But gradually, session by session, we had built a new foundation based on truth rather than narrative convenience. Emma and Tyler have noticed the difference, Paul said. There's less tension at home, more open conversation. Emma actually asked me last week if she could interview both of us for a school project on family communication, Melanie said, smiling at me. She says we're her case study in how to fight right. Fighting right, Dr. Marshall repeated thoughtfully. That's an excellent way to frame it. Conflict isn't the problem. How we navigate it is what matters. I've been thinking a lot about something you said in our second session, Dr. Marshall, I said, about truth being multi-layered and perspective-based. How 2 people can experience the same event differently without either being wrong. That's been particularly relevant to your situation, she agreed. It's helped me understand that Melanie's feelings about my parenting can be valid even when her specific memories or interpretations weren't entirely accurate, I explained. The emotional impact was real, regardless of intent. Melanie nodded. And I've had to accept that my mother's intentions matter too. That she was doing her best with the tools she had, just as I am with my children. Dr. Marshall made a note. This mutual recognition represents tremendous growth for both of you. It hasn't been easy, Jack observed. There were sessions I wasn't sure we'd make it through. Like when we discussed the college decision, Melanie remembered with a wince. That had been our most difficult session, unpacking the complex emotions around Melanie's college choices and our financial limitations. The layered resentments and misunderstandings had nearly derailed our progress. But we did make it through, I pointed out. Because we stayed committed to honesty, even when it hurt. And because we agreed to look forward, not just backward, Melanie added. To focus on the relationship we want to build, not just the one we had. Dr. Marshall smiled at both of us. That's the essence of family healing, not erasing the past, but learning from it to create a healthier future. As our session concluded and we gathered our things to leave, I felt a profound sense of gratitude. Not just for the reconciliation with my daughter, though that was precious beyond measure, but for the deeper wisdom this painful journey had yielded. Standing in the parking lot afterward, Melanie hesitated by her car. Mom, would you and Dad like to come over for dinner this weekend? Emma's been asking to make Grandma Louise's cranberry relish recipe with you. I'd love that, I said, my heart full. And maybe afterward we could continue reading through those old letters of your grandmother's? Perfect, Melanie agreed. The kids are fascinated by her stories of growing up during the Depression. As Jack and I watched them drive away, he put his arm around my shoulders. Who would have thought, 3 months ago, that we'd be here? Healing isn't linear, I said, recalling Dr. Marshall's words from an earlier session, but it is possible when there's love beneath the hurt. The lessons of our journey had become increasingly clear to me over these months of difficult work. Truth is indeed multi-layered and perspective-based. What parents intend and what children experience can differ dramatically without invalidating either reality. Real love requires both honesty and forgiveness. Without honesty, relationships remain superficial. Without forgiveness, they cannot heal from inevitable hurts. Healing comes from facing pain together, not exploiting it for personal gain or avoiding it out of fear. Family relationships can be rebuilt with courage and compassion, even after significant betrayal. The foundations may need to be entirely reconstructed, but the resulting structure can be stronger than before. Perhaps most importantly, we all carry generational patterns that need conscious breaking. My mother's alcoholism shaped my overcorrection toward stability and control. My approach influenced Melanie's parenting in ways neither of us had fully recognized. But awareness creates choice. With consciousness comes the possibility of change. That evening, I added a new entry to the journal I'd been keeping since Melanie left for college. But instead of writing to her, I wrote to myself, acknowledging the growth of the past 3 months, celebrating the renewed connection with my daughter, and expressing hope for the generations to come. As I wrote, I thought about all the mothers and daughters navigating their own complex relationships. How many were struggling as we had? How many needed permission to acknowledge both love and hurt, both good intentions and painful impact? Our story wasn't perfect. Real healing never is. There would be difficult conversations ahead, moments of regression, new challenges to navigate. But we were facing them together now, with eyes open and hearts willing. That, I realized, was perhaps the greatest gift we could offer Emma and Tyler. Not perfect grandparents or parents, but adults willing to acknowledge mistakes, learn from them, and keep showing up with love, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. Have you experienced complex family dynamics that needed healing? What helped your family bridge misunderstandings or heal from past hurts? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. If this resonated with you, please like this video and subscribe to my channel for more real-life stories about family healing and personal growth. And if you know someone struggling with a difficult family relationship, consider sharing this video with them. Sometimes knowing others have walked a similar path can provide comfort and hope. Thank you for listening to my story today, and I wish you courage and compassion on your own family journey.